The next part of the brain that we're going to look at is the diencephalon, which I think by the time I'm through, you will agree is a pretty fascinating area of the brain. The most superior portion of the diencephalon is the thalamus. All of the sensory information in your body, except smell, is sent to the thalamus. Now, this would include pressure, temperature, sight, hearing, um, any kind of sensory input that you could have except smell is sent here. It turns out smell is the most primitive of the senses, and it is tied into directly into other parts of the brain. One interesting example of how smell works that you're probably not aware of is that it turns out that we have certain genetic compatibilities with other people that are better than other. And it turns out that somehow our subconscious sense of smell can register who from the opposite sex we're most compatible with genetically to mate with. So that if you could be physically attracted to somebody, but you could, once you got a good smell of them, you might not be as attracted, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. Now, the thalamus is getting 11 million pieces of data every second, but only 126 can be sent to the cerebrum. That's just a very, very small fraction. The cerebrum is where your conscious thought is, which means most of what your thalamus is getting, in fact, the vast, vast, vast majority, is never sent to your conscious brain. So what determines what goes to your conscious brain? Well, your conscious brain can direct it. For example, if I say right now, I want you to feel the pressure of the fabric on your left rear end. There you go. Now, when you put your brain to that and you think about it, oh yeah, you're aware of the fabric there. Now, it's not like you grew a new nerve. That same information was coming to your brain 1 minute ago, but it's not anything you were consciously aware of because your thalamus didn't consider it important. Second, what determines is any sensory input with emotional or emergency input. So, for example, if you heard gunshots, for example, that would be sent to your conscious centers because it could be an emergency type situation. If you heard a baby crying, that would be sent to your to your conscious centers. And then, and this is some of the most fascinating stuff of all, we have these subconscious filters that the thalamus works through before it ever sends it on. So it can be your beliefs, something based upon your experience or something that you've learned. You would be more likely or less likely to be interested in something. For example, if you were a doctor and you heard something that was of a technical nature about medicine that most people would not even recognize what they were talking about, and you heard it, it would probably go to the conscious centers, whereas somebody who didn't understand the verbiage, it would not be. Your memories can determine whether something is sent or not. Let's say you had a horrible reaction to a bee sting or something like that, and you saw a bee. You're a lot more likely to send that to your conscious center than somebody else that's just walking along and notices a bee somewhere. Your values can influence whether or not something is forwarded on. Let's say that you have a very strong, I don't know, let's keep this value for ice cream, okay? And you drive by a Baskin Robbins, just and that's a store on the side of the road, you're a lot more likely to see that, to notice that than somebody else. Our language determines how we value things because with that language comes a lot of customs and things that we're brought up with. Uh, your attitude does. The emotional content, anytime you have an emotional weight to anything, it's more likely to go to the conscious center. So, for example, President Trump, whether you're for him or against him, you probably have emotional weight behind your decision. And so you're more likely to notice uh, an article about him or something than you would be about some senator whose name you didn't know. Um, then there's physical attributes that come into play. There can be not enough time for you to register enough information to send it forward, or too much information. And you may feel like that sometimes when you're studying for a test, that there's too much to send up to your conscious center. So, what options does the thalamus have? Well, it can delete the data, and it does that with the vast majority of it. All of the nerves reporting in about the fabric that you're wearing, or the temperature that things are right now, and things like that are not going to be relevant to you tomorrow. And so, most likely, you're just tossing that. But you can also distort data. And we do this, data tends to match our expectations. Like if we're watching a football game and there's a call that can go, oh, let's just say it can go either way. If you're a big fan of one team, you are likely to perceive that data differently than a fan of the opposite team. And it's actually a true perception on your part, which is also interesting, especially if you want to start talking about politics or religion or something like that. We also sometimes generalize the data. We drop it into categories like jocks, for example, or lazy people, or geeks, or anything like that. And then sometimes we just send the raw data up to the cerebrum and say, okay, this is the raw data. What are we going to do? Now, you might wonder, can I increase? Only 126 data bits a second can get up to the cerebrum. You may think that's an awful lot, but compared to 11 million, it's not a whole lot at all. So can you increase the amount going forward? Turns out that you can. It turns out, for example, that a positive attitude is extremely important, not only to sending that up to the cerebrum, but then basically how you respond to it and then perform to it. For example, there's a very important principle in coaching to never put a negative thought into a player's head. So, for example, you would never say to your field goal kicker, don't miss, because you put the word miss in his head. So, what you say is, make it. You don't put any negatives into the conversation. And anybody that's coached kids, for example, for any constructive comment that you want to make, you need to make 2 or 3 positive comments so that you keep the positive attitude, because you get a positive effect when you do. You can also change how information is presented, which is why I typically draw a lot of things. That's also why my notes are so illustrated. But the drawings in particular that I do, which, by the way, if you really want to learn the data that I'm presenting, anytime I draw something, you draw something, if I haven't told you that already. Just looking at it because you've got it on tape is not good enough. There is a reason why I don't have these drawings in my notes. I could very easily sketch these things out, scan them in, and drop them into my notes. But I don't do that. Specifically because drawing them helps you out. And it is also presenting the data in a different way. I think of it like an infographic or something like that. Lastly, asking questions about anything, even if you're asking a question to yourself and then looking up the answer on Google or something like that, you're much more likely to increase the amount of data going to your cerebrum because you're engaging different parts of your brain. Okay, so the thalamus, pretty interesting. But as interesting as the thalamus is, and I would say it's very interesting, it is, well, let's just say maybe the most important part of your brain, as far as the smallest part of your brain that you never know anything about that's doing the most, is the hypothalamus. Because it has got 2 jobs that are huge. The first is it controls your autonomic nervous system. Now, remember, the autonomic nervous system, that's all the involuntary stuff for your sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. Sympathetic, the 4 F's. If you need fight, flight, fright, or frolic. If you need to hit it, run from it, be afraid of it, or have sex with it, you need a sympathetic response. Well, are those things important? I would argue that they are. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. Are those important? I would say certainly so. Then you put that with the fact that it regulates a lot of the endocrine organs. So the hypothalamus is going to determine things like, what age do you hit puberty or menopause? How much sleep do you need? How likely are you to be fat? Lots and lots of things are under the control of the hypothalamus, and it's also maintaining homeostasis, which is that balance that we want. It's the hypothalamus that's going to make sure that your blood pH is okay and their temperature is regulated and all of that. It's going to make sure that in an emergency, your body is ready to get you out of the emergency. So the hypothalamus, major, major on the importance scale.